First up, we're going to look at agency business models. And I'm going to ask Professor Michael Farmer up onto the stage, former Bain and BCG consultant, practical academic, I think it's right to say, and author of Madison Avenue Manslaughter. There is probably a clue to his thesis in that title. Michael, take to the stage.
I came dressed to be boring. I came dressed to represent the business model, which defines the capabilities of everyone in the advertising business. Now, I'm not in the advertising business except as a consultant. So the only thing I know, like most consultants, is from the data that I gather when I'm working with my clients, whether they're ad agencies or whether they're advertisers. I've come to the conclusion that this industry has everything that it needs to succeed and to do all the wonderful things that we heard about for the last half an hour, except the right business model and the leadership to change it. So my discussion today is going to be about, it's like the water in the goldfish bowl. That's the business model. And if it gets polluted, the fish die. And the reason that we have poor ads and unhappy people and downsizings and too much turnover and a plethora of ads is because of the business model. So I'd like you to think that the business model really creates the environment in which you can do the very best that you can do. And the business environment really needs some change. So let's talk about what needs to be fixed in the business model so that the best work and the most effective work can go on. And let's talk about the leadership requirements of doing it. I had a very, very strong working group that commented on almost anything that we discussed by group. So a lot of what comes out here today is a consensus view of the business model problems. Much of the data that I'm going to show you is the data that I've developed working as a consultant over the last 30 years, starting here in the UK where I lived for 20 years, and then moving on to the States. So 32 years of client data that will describe the environment. The business model involves a number of units that are all seeking to satisfy their own needs. Let's think of it as 7 kinds of operations. We've got Wall Street in the city because so many of the players that affect the outcome of the industry are publicly owned. We have advertisers, and I'm putting the CEO, CFO, and Chief Procurement Officer up there. We've got the marketing CMO, who is somewhere between the C-suite at the top and the marketing and the brands and the procurement that work in the brands who develop scopes of work and pay fees. So we've got Wall Street, the advertiser, the CMO, the brands, procurement, SOWs, and fees. And then on the right-hand side, we have the holding companies, which have become the dominant force in the industry since the late 80s. Martin Sorrell in particular in 1986 buying JWT and then later buying Ogilvy, although Interpublic had existed for quite a few years before that. And then of course we have the creative and media agencies and all the others, leaving out the public relations and the production and the influencers and search, programmatic and all the other things. And the independent agencies who do the best they can in the environment that's created for them. Now, the interconnections among those are complicated. And fixing the business model is not just changing the way that agencies are paid. As many people would say, the thing that's wrong with the business model is we're paid on a man-hour basis, and there's just a guess at the man-hours, but the work is greater. So if we could fix that, everything would be okay. Actually, that's not possible. It's not possible unless from the very top to the bottom of the business model participants, There's a change in the way they deal with each other. You just can't change the pricing without it affecting others. For example, if we look down here at the scopes and fees and get more money for agencies by being paid for the amount of work they do, which is huge, it affects the entire cost structure of everything that's above it. It raises costs for advertisers in particular. What are they going to do if costs go up? If they're not performing well, they're going to find alternatives. So it isn't as simple as changing one thing in the business model. Now, the one thing that the holding companies and the advertisers share in common is a great concern with share price. In fact, it may be the only thing that they really care about. In order to drive share price, they need an acceleration of growth, a widening of profit margins, and then, of course, given the way compensation works these days, C-suite executives are really highly paid since 1990 for the last 35 years or so. And so if the stock market performs well because clients are growing and profits are growing as well, then C-suite executives protect the amount of money that they're making for themselves. And both the holding companies and the advertisers have that in common. Agency holding company CEOs are paid quite well, really well above Fortune 500 levels. And the advertiser levels are paid astronomical sums of money for achieving improved share price performance. So let's take one look at the constraints that are involved. And that, of course, is, as David Beacon pointed out to me in our working group, it's difficult to get a man or a woman to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And if there are any changes in the business model that have the likelihood of disrupting the numbers that are being produced, whether it's the growth of sales or the growth of profitability, or the share price itself, you can be sure it will be resisted. Now, I wrote a book called Madison Avenue Makeover about Huge's transformation under Matt Baxter, beginning in 2021. And it was clear that Matt, who wanted to totally overhaul his agency, was not going to deliver his numbers to IPG for a couple of years. Now, Huge is small. Huge is very small compared to IPG. But when IPG's numbers kind of hit the skids in 2022 and 2023, they were quick to blame Huge, a tiny agency, and RGA, a relatively small agency within it, for the shortfall in earnings, even though that was mathematically impossible, and none of the analysts pick it up. So there was something to blame, and I'm now told that Huge and RGA are on the block, not to be part of the IPG portfolio in the future. So be careful if you transform something and upset the numbers, because it's going to irritate people who depend on those numbers for their personal compensation. Let's talk about what advertisers, the choices they have made to enhance their share price performance. Now, I'm looking at a long period, a 15-year period since 2009. This is information drawn from public sources. From 2009 to 2023, after the financial meltdown, media spend has been doubled. Now, doubling of media spend in 15 years is about 5% per year compounded, which doesn't sound like very much, but it's more than many advertisers grow. So, media spend doubled. Creative deliverables have trebled. And the number of creative FTEs that are being paid for only went up 17%. So it's a lot harder to do brilliant creative work if you have fewer people relative to the work, and those people are more junior, and they don't have the experience of Sir John Haggerty or others of his capability, if there are any. We have an ecosystem of very junior creatives that were, in many cases, born after the great creative work in the industry was done, and have only known the industry from its digital and social origins beginning around 2005. So they don't have the tradition, they don't understand the history, they never worked in the environment. There are fewer of them relative to the workload, and they're struggling to get things done. Now, how has this worked for the big advertisers? I'm not going to focus on the success stories of Amazon or Netflix or Apple or Progressive Insurance or some of the others that have really been barn burners over the last 15 years. I'm going to show you the results of 21 of the top 50 advertisers in the world to take a look at their share price performance and their sales. And there it is. I've put it, you can see, in 2009, I put their sales at an index of 100, and I put their share price at an index of 100 so that we could compare the two. The first thing you'll see is that income grew for these 21, and who does this include? P&G, Nestle, Colgate-Palmolive, Unilever, IBM, Bank of America, and many other banks, many of the pharma companies. These are big advertisers. These are people who depend on advertising for their lifeblood, and they basically didn't grow at all as a group. Whereas the economy grew at 2.1% in the West, 2.1% per year, which is a 30%, 31% from point to point. These folks grew next at zero. However, their share price grew, and it wasn't due to marketing. It was due to finance, who did share buybacks, dividend increases, changes in the capital structure, and it was due to procurement, who cut costs. So marketing can take very little credit for the positive share price performance of 6.4%. Now, what is that 6.4%? That is sort of halfway between the growth in creative deliverables and the growth of media spend. But it didn't impact sales at all. So for all the talk that advertising delivers value, there is too much of it that actually doesn't deliver value. And that is the fault of the advertisers themselves. In response, they have cut fees to their ad agencies. And what I'm showing up here is, in essence, the price per kilo of scope of work stuff. Not price per deliverable, but the weight of the scopes of work. It has been declining at a 5% rate for over 30 years. And in the period under discussion here, they have cut the fees to the agencies for scopes of work, which have grown by 50%. To which agencies who are publicly owned can only respond by reducing their own costs and downsizing their own people. So, response to advertisers not growing, they treat advertising as a cost and not an investment, because the investment hasn't proven itself out in growing sales, not even growing as fast as GDP. The other thing that they've done is vastly increased scopes of work so that that 17% increase in FTEs in creative have to slam out more work. Now, this is data from my clients, and I can't prove that it's representative of the industry. But when I did my first piece of work in 1992 for Ogilvy UK, which had 50 creatives and was doing 360 ads, the average creative did 7 pieces a year, and they had weeks to do it. TV, radio, print. 2 years ago, yeah, well, a little more than 2 years ago, feels like 2. In 2019, I did another major office that had 50 creatives, and it was doing 15,000 pieces of work, which is 311 pieces per creative, or one per day, over which no executive creative director could have the slightest influence. So that you have kids cranking out stuff like a factory cranks out widgets in order to try to find spray and pray, to find something that might work for the advertiser. That's the advertiser's scope of work, and that's the agency not pushing back. Why? Because they're scared. They don't want to lose the client. They have to make their numbers. So if the clients don't know what works, and they try everything because they can get away with it, because they have the power, they have the money, they own the scopes, the agencies will salute and say, sure, we can handle it. I mean, you know, it's a sacrifice for us, but we're can-do people. So that is a massive increase of work, and the fact that it has not delivered sales growth for nearly half of the major advertisers says that it's not very effective from a scope standpoint. All right, let's shift our attention to the holding companies, who are now either victims or passive players in this. The first thing we'll look at is what happened to the sales and the share price of, I'm taking three holding companies here, WPP, IPG, and Omnicom. First of all, their share price during the days of acquisition had a great run, and we all read about it in those days, from 1986, Martin Sorrell, up to 2018, when he either left or was fired because the share price had declined by 30%. The share prices went up and they started to come down as the growth slowed down. And the revenue grew at 2.5% per year, but only because they were doing acquisitions. The underlying organic revenue is very weak. Now you could say their share price is, you know, trying to come back a bit, at overall point to point, maybe 6% per year, which is about matching the share price of the underperforming clients. But the holding companies are in difficulty because they've gotten rid of their senior talent, they've downsized, they've kept their salary levels at unsustainably low levels, starting salaries in New York, right out of university, $40,000 a year, which you can barely rent an apartment for that. So it's tough on the people. With respect to the structure, they've merged agencies in order to get rid of top management. They deny that's what they're doing, but that's actually what they've done if you look at their staffing. And they've downgraded the value of the brands. You almost hear nothing about Saatchi or Leo Burnett or McCann or FCB or many of the other brands. We have to tip our hat to Publicis, who seem to have found a holding company way of outperforming the other holding companies. But for the most part, the holding companies and their agencies are in a much weaker position today on that side of the street. For the independent agencies, that ought to be the opportunity of a lifetime, because the big holding company agencies don't push back. They're doing excessive scopes of work with people that are not trained to do it, don't do it well. There needs to be less work, more focused on solving brand problems, and less management just giving in to what the client wants because they're afraid to lose the revenue. Now, that's an abbreviation. Let me just say that our group feels that the advertiser executives have been defeated by media complexity, and that is the source of all problems. They don't know what works. And therefore, as a result, they try everything, the holding companies agree, and as a result, the work is too big, too much for junior people, not generating the value for clients, which leads to agencies being turned over all the time, and senior management having to spend all its time on new business development. That's the sea in which we operate. Agencies have not filled the intellectual gap. And as a result, we're left with the bad decisions of marketing that are not filled by agencies behaving in an aggressive and smart fashion. And so I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to just skip over the rest because that's basically what I was going to tell you. Agencies have to fill the gap in order to deliver value and to help their clients do a better job of realizing value from the spend that they make in media, the spend they make in creativity, the spend they make on their own operations. Thank you very much.